Good evening. Welcome to the study session of July 23rd, 2024. Call to order. Donna, you do a roll call, please.
Well, Councilmember Blush.
Here.
Councilmember Stearns. Councilmember Gilmore.
Here.
Marinesco.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Sherman.
Here.
Councilmember Sapp.
Here.
And we have Councilmember Gutierrez on Zoom.
Here.
Thank you, Donna.
You're welcome.
Tonight we have a presentation from Troy Nichols with Nichols Group Government Relations, and we're going to start out with the city manager.
You, Mr. Mayor, sorry to interrupt you.
Oh.
Appreciate it. I just wanted to give Troy an, I guess, official introduction. Troy's been working with the city of Shelton for
2017, I think was the first.
Okay,
Yeah.
it's 8 years, formerly with another organization, now the Nichols Group, but Troy represents our interests over in Olympia with our state delegation and flag makers over there to assure that city of Shelton, our region, is being heard and what the needs are in our community. As you know, we maybe some of you don't know that we adopt a legislative agenda every year prior to the session. Work with council to develop that agenda based on what we believe are attainable goals and needs here in the community, but also statewide, particularly with AWC and Association of Washington Cities legislative agenda at the same time. So try to talk a little bit about the history here, some of the successes we've had, the work he's doing, what he anticipates happening in the next session over in Olympia, and then we can talk a little bit about how we're going to progress through utilizing his services and the council, meeting the council's goals going into this next session. So I'll pass it over to Troy.
All right, thanks, Mark, for the introduction. It's nice meeting several of you for the first time. A lot of new faces on council, and yeah, that I was thinking about the history on the drive up here. 2017 was the first session. We put together a legislative agenda and then it rolled into lobbying and haven't looked back. So we've had a pretty good run and some successes. So I don't know if we're sharing the presentation or not. Can I? Yeah, if you can. I don't want to screw anything up. So. This would be easier for me to do it.
Well, he had shared earlier on this one. Mike did.
So do I move it or do you move it? Okay. So just wanted to kind of give a quick overview of the presentation tonight. And again, this is a work session. We want folks to feel free to ask questions. Please interrupt me. I think I just want to go through a quick introduction. Mark did most of that. And then kind of give you an overview of what we've done on behalf of the city over the last several years. That'll get kind of the creative juices flowing too as to what we've accomplished in areas where we can seek state funding for projects and economic development infrastructure projects for the city of Shelton. Talk a little bit about campaigns because we are in the middle of the campaign season and sort of the outlook for the legislature and the makeup of the legislature in 2025. And then go into some of the specifics about the operating budget, the capital budget, and the transportation budget, because all of those dynamics impact sort of what we can ask for, the prospects of securing funding for some of the infrastructure projects. And then again, talk about some of the areas where we can seek funding, and then maybe turn it over to Mark and we could talk about some things that we've having the irons in the fire, because obviously we didn't get everything we asked for last session. It was a short supplemental. There's stuff that's still in our agenda from 2024 that we can pursue next time. And then we might want to augment or add to that list as well. So please feel free to interrupt as we go along and we'll go from there. So go ahead, Mary. So just want to run through some of, again, the list of things that we were successful in securing. And I want to stay up front. I'm only a small part of this. process. I help interface with the legislature, but I don't think that we could have been as successful as we've been over the years. Not only without the great help of staff who has to put all the background and put the projects together so we can have a credible ask when we go to the legislature, but also our legislative delegation as well. We've benefited tremendously over the years. There have been a few changes from Senator Shelton, now Senator McEwen, Representative Couture, Representative Griffey. Without their working together on our behalf, I don't know that we are nearly as successful as we've been over the years. So I just want to make sure that we acknowledge the hard work on behalf of a lot of people that get these things done. Last session, it was a short session, 2024. We did receive design funding for the multi-use trail project. And then in what was a bit of a surprise, because and we'll talk about this later, the transportation budget of late has been pretty lean in terms of local projects and securing funds. But we were able to get $1 million for additional improvements at the Wallace-Needland intersection. I understand we may have a little bit of work to do on that budget proviso with the department, but that was a pretty big get for Mason County and that project in Shelton last session. In 2023, we got $250,000 for some of the security access control upgrades. And then a fairly large appropriation for the Angleside Reservoir capacity upgrades. And you'll see water projects have been kind of a big deal for the city over the last several biennia. So next slide, Mary. We did get funding in 2022 for the Shelton Police Department parking facility. Obviously, there were some security concerns there, and we were able to address some of those with that money. And then again, another large appropriation in 2022 for the headworks capacity upgrades at the water reclamation plant. 2021 was a big year for infrastructure improvements. You may remember we were going through a little bit of a pandemic at the time. The federal government was obviously cranking out infrastructure assistance and support to local communities. We were able to secure more than our fair share of that, frankly, for the three large projects, or the first two large projects listed here, the Well 1 and the Reclaimed Water Project. And then we were also able to get rid of, you may remember what was called the Latecomer agreement we had with Washington State Patrol out across the highway for the police academy. That was really putting a damper on and adding a significant cost burden to future development out there. And after trying in 2020, we got a proviso. It was vetoed by the governor. We came back in 2021, working with the governor's office. We were able to secure not only getting rid of that Latecomer agreement, but shifting some money from the waste tire removal account to satisfy that infrastructure payment that the city was on the hook for. So that was kind of a big deal.
That was 3 years, wasn't it? It took us to get rid of that. 3 sessions.
It took two. We drew a veto in 2020,
Yeah.
Which the next slide it's on there. But we kept at it and did a little bit of early groundwork with the governor's office on the second try. Interface with a couple of different personnel. Somebody retired and we had a better outcome. And then we did get in 2020, the last $750,000 to complete the Shelton YMCA. In 2029, again, we first got our first installment of resources for that Wallace-Needland Shelton Springs intersection, which I think is starting to flow, but it's been on the books for a little while. And I can't help not mentioning the Civic City parking lot. It's nice to drive by that, see those basketball hoops and that pavement. Because it took a long time not only to get the funding, but then to get the project completed. And then 2018, that was the first year as working with the city on contract as their lobbyist. Downtown connector is kind of a big deal. That first roundabout kind of changed kind of the flow of the city down there. And then we were also successful in getting some capital budget money for the Timberland library repair. So that just kind of gives you a flavor of where we've been over the years, and maybe get the creative juices flowing in terms of what we might be interested in pursuing in the future. So next slide, Mary. So again, politics happens. Most of you are aware of this in the Senate. The current legislative makeup is 29 Democrats, 20 Republicans, similar split in the House. I think that, given the dynamics that we've seen, especially for the last few weeks, it's hard to predict what the outcome of the campaigns are going to be in the general election. But with redistricting, the sophistication of legislative redistricting software, so few districts are anymore competitive. So unlike in previous decades, it's hard to predict seeing big swings in the partisan makeup of the legislature from one election cycle to another. I think regardless, we'll probably still see significant Democratic majorities in the legislature in 2025, barring some game-changing event. So all things being relatively equal, I think we'll see the same leadership in 2025. Speaker Jenkins is expected to return as speaker, but if you recall, Senate Majority Leader Andy Billing announced his retirement at the end of last session, so he won't be back. There'll be an internal caucus battle for that new position, and we don't expect to get word on that until after the November elections. And then on the Republican side, it's relatively stable. Senator Braun will likely be back, as will Representative Drew Stokesbury as the caucus leaders there. So, Mary, next slide. Wanted to point out some further dynamics. The chairs of the fiscal committees that we tend to traffic in with these requests are going to remain largely unchanged. You know, the Ways and Means chair, she's not currently up for election right now. She's in the middle of a 4-year term. Representative Ormsby, the operating budget chair from Spokane, he's running for another term. He's in a relatively safe seat. The only one exception to that is the Democratic lead on capital budget, Senator Mark Mullet, who, as you understand, is running for governor and won't be back in the legislature. So there'll be a new Democratic lead in the Senate for the capital budget. But a lot of stability. And the second bullet point is something that I referenced earlier. Again, the predictions are highly volatile just because of the national picture right now. Either party can pick up a few seats here and there. Large swings are probably not on the table. But the key point I want to make, particularly in the capital budget, in order to issue bonds for debt, and that makes up a big chunk of the capital budget, it requires a 3/5 vote of both chambers of the legislature. Right now, the current makeup, partisan split, if Republicans lose one more seat in either chamber, they'll dip below that threshold. And so if that happens, Republicans will just candidly have less say in what goes into the budgets, particularly the capital and transportation budgets, because they don't have that leverage on the bond vote. It's been a long time. It's been early in my career when I was a staffer, when Republicans dip below that threshold. And I don't want to say that they won't get anything in the budget, because frankly, these budgets have gotten more bipartisan over the last few years. But they probably will get as much say in those budgets as they would if they had that bond vote leverage. So there is something at stake for the elections on the Republican side. If they lose seats, they lose that leverage in the legislative process. And just real quick, of our 35th legislative delegation, as we talked about, Senator Drew McEwen, he's midterm on his Senate seat, but he's running for Congress. If he's successful, there'll probably be an appointment to fill his slot. I would think that either Dan Griffey or Travis Couture would probably be the front runners for an appointment like that. But if Senator McEwen's not successful, he'll be back in Olympia in January, still serving, representing the 35th legislative district. So next slide, Mary. So shifting a little bit to the operating budget dynamics, and I talk about the operating budget not because we typically go there for projects and resources, but because they have an impact on the capital budget specifically. And for the first time since the pandemic, we got the June 2024 revenue forecast, and it was down. After the initial dip, when the pandemic first hit, the revenue forecasts have gone nowhere but up every quarter since then, except for now with the last revenue forecast that came in last month. So for the current biennium, it was down almost $500 million. And then projecting out for the next biennium, it was down $189 million. Those aren't big numbers relative to a $70 billion budget, but it does show a trend. And then as as revenues tend to dip and the budget on the operating side becomes a little tight, the first place budget writers look is the capital budget to see if they can sweep funds or use that to maintain programs in the operating budget. It just adds additional pressure and thus reduces our ability to secure funding for infrastructure projects and buildings. And I included that quote from David Schumacher. He's Inslee's budget director. Basically sending the word out in an article just this week to state agencies that they shouldn't be asking for new programs or new money because they're already signaling that the operating budget is going to be fairly tight. So next slide. One of the other things that I always mention when I give these presentations is that about 75% of the state operating budget is quote unquote constitutionally protected. So that covers things mainly like K-12 spending, which is almost half the budget, just right off the top. After the McCleary decision, paramount duty of the state, a lot of that money is already accounted for. And then you have what the state is contractually obligated to pay for, and that pensions, labor contracts, and debt service for capital budget bond, general obligation bonds and whatnot. And then in Washington state, we tend to budget on a current service level process. So basically they spend what it takes to maintain existing services, and then anything extra has to be accounted for and added on top of the current service level budget. One of the big dynamics that we're waiting for the outcome in November are the three initiatives that are on the ballot. The repeal of the Climate Commitment Act, the capital gains tax repeal, and the long-term care act, making that voluntary. Now, regardless of how you feel about those initiatives or whether they pass or fail, if they do pass, that will at least initially have a significant impact, not only on the operating budget, but the transportation budget and the capital budget. A lot of the resources from the auctions and the Climate Commitment Act go to those budgets and pay for programs and whatnot. So if they go away, it's obviously going to crimp what's available in all three budgets moving forward. So we go to the next slide. And then moving to the capital budget, as I just mentioned, if there's an economic slowdown or a recession, there are some predictions of that. The revenue forecasts seem to at least indicate somewhat of a slowdown. That creates pressure to sweep the capital budget to support the operating budget. This current biennium, there were $4.7 billion in general obligation bonds that were issued. That supports the capital budget. It's about 2/3 of the funding for that. And because the revenues, except for last quarter, have grown over the last couple of years, that's what dictates what the bond capacity is. So we expect that to be higher than that $4.7 billion. And then one of the big areas that we get funding for projects in is they're called local and community projects in the capital budget. And these are individual projects that legislators can request on behalf of an interest group or a municipality or a county. And it tends to be a long list. And just to give you a little bit of perspective, in the current biennium, there was just over 300 million allocated to those projects, 525 of them total. But these typically aren't big projects. The average is just under $575,000. And they range anywhere from a $15,000 project to up to $5.7 million for a water system project that I found in the capital budget last biennium. So the range is pretty big, but the average is just a little over $500,000.
That statewide?
Yeah, that's for everything that across the state, every local community project that was in the budget. And not all legislative districts are created equal, which is a good point. Some districts have universities, some have a lot of state buildings. Mason County doesn't tend to have that. And so it's disproportionate in terms of how much funding we see, just because they have more state needs or more state infrastructure and buildings that need to be taken care of. But we do punch outside of our weight class quite often. We are fairly successful in what we are able to bring back home to the 35th. So next slide. And then just to give you a little bit of an idea on what the capital budget typically will pay for. Acquisition of land and buildings, construction of new buildings, major repairs, reconstruction and additions to existing buildings, utility, landscaping and infrastructure work, planning and design. And then there's a portion of every project that is dedicated to just the administrative cost of getting that money out the door and managing those grants. They typically, the projects need to have at least a useful life of 13 years and involve some kind of design, architect or engineer. And when you're issuing 25-year general obligation bonds, they typically are more stringent on these rules because taxpayers are taking 25 years to pay off those obligations. So there's a little bit more scrutiny there. Some things you won't see on this list, things with wheels. A lot of electronics or electronic infrastructure is typically not funded just because, again, the funding source is typically bonds. And so they don't like to pay for things that don't have a life of 13 or more years. So think buildings, think land, think pipes, think infrastructure. That's typically what you see in the capital budget. On the transportation side, this budget, $14.5 billion. But it's been a struggle, and you've all read the paper and you've seen some of the typically traditional transportation revenues like the gas tax tend to be shrinking. As we make the shift to more fuel efficient vehicles, electronic vehicles, that gas tax, even though the cost per gallon is not going down, it's just the total gallons that are sold are going down. So those dollars don't go as far as they used to, even 5 years ago. Just to give you some perspective on the Climate Commitment Act, there is in the current budget 1.3 billion from those auction sales of credits in the current budget. So the Climate Commitment Act goes away. It gives you a little bit of perspective of the hole that's going to be there moving forward. In the last couple of biennium, particularly in 2023, legislators were told early on, don't expect a lot of new money for local projects. And this has been the case for the last couple of years for these very reasons. You've had a decrease in the available revenue from traditional sources. You've had some mega projects that have had some cost overruns across the state. And so we've really been in triage mode on the transportation budget for the last couple of biennium, which is why we were pretty fortunate to get that $1 million for Wallace Neyland stretch last session, because we have been told for years not to expect more. Now, whether that's still going to be the case, next session is sort of up in the air. Depends on the outcome of a lot of different things. And if I had a crystal ball, I would tell you, but I unfortunately don't. And again, a lot of that's going to depend on the outcome of I-2117, other factors. We just won't know until we get past November and see what we're dealing with come January. So that's a lot of information to kick out there. I wanted to turn it over to Mark, because I know he has some ideas on at least to start the discussion on what we can pursue next session. But that's sort of this picture as I see it now anyway.
I guess before we dive into that, do you have any questions for Troy just on process, what's happening in Olympia before we kind of get into the project discussion?
Do we have any CCA money we're holding right now? Okay, because
I believe so.
I know the transit's concerned that
Yeah.
they are holding CCA money and it goes away. And
Yeah, the indication is to get that committed as quickly as possible and spend those funds as fast as you can.
And while there has been pots of that money around in the state budget for the last couple of biennium, most of that has had to have been obligated. So there's no magic pot of money sitting around from the feds as there has been in the last couple of years.
Okay, I'll just recap kind of the 2024 legislative agenda. We put this together with Troy's assistance. Council approved it back on November 21st of 2023. With specific asks in a couple categories. One was transportation. Wallace Neyland Boulevard has been on our ask list for 4 or 5 years, maybe more. We're seeing that they're not necessarily failing per our standards at this point, but they're failing at certain points of the day, or they're just not performing well. The intersections at Wallace Neyland Olympic Highway, Wallace Neyland Spring Road, Wallace Neyland Johns Prairie. Again, we're lucky enough to have $1 million from this last session and $650,000 from forget, 21,
To
22. Those are being obligated as we speak. The question is how do we spend those? $1 million right now is specifically identified for pedestrian, ADA, and bicycle facilities. Building a roundabout at any of those intersections is out of the question right now with available funds. So it will come back to you probably in the very near future about how to couple that with the $650,000 specifically for Spring Road and Wallace Neon, and how to benefit the community at that intersection, whether it's re-signaling, doing the design on the roundabout, seeking funding later at some other day's time. We have some options to upgrade those lights and signals to maybe have some dedicated turn signals in there in the interim to meet some of those needs, especially during peak hours with school letting in and out. But those are the major transportation elements. The multimodal path, again, was on our list last year. We were lucky enough to receive $200,000 for design for that project. We have about 90% design at this point for removal of the tracks and developing at least a gravel crushed rock trail in down that right of way. So that'll be kind of the interim improvement that we see over the next several months. But we'll put that $200,000 to work certainly with that project. There is social needs, homeless mitigation sites, affordable housing, behavioral health resources have been at the top of AWC's list. As we all know, we're experiencing a lack of resources for behavioral health in our communities. They're very difficult to address in small organizations such as the city of Shelton. So any assistance from the state is certainly warranted, and it's been at the top of AWC's list for the last couple of years. AWC also highlighted the continuation of investing in infrastructure. We need affordable housing. We need housing at all levels. Small jurisdictions like the city of Shelton have needs and gaps in our infrastructure. So continuing making that investment in infrastructure will help build out housing and add to our housing stock. Recruitment and retention of police officers has been another one of their priorities. There's many different ways to approach that, I think, but not necessarily, it hasn't necessarily been funneled apparently down to one avenue, but it's certainly a concern of ours. It's hard. Again, I'm going to keep harping on the lack of resources a small municipality has, like the city of Shelton, but we need to start talking about competing with some larger jurisdictions with more resources and offering signing bonuses or higher salaries and things like that. It's difficult to retain police officers if they are just looking at total compensation. If you're looking at the community and the organization that they work for, I think we compete very well. But if somebody's looking for that compensation, then maybe we're falling behind a little bit. Also on AWC's list this past year was property tax cap limits. I think since about 20 years, the 1%, I think property tax was adopted in the legislature. They've asked for at least some consideration to amend that to be associated with an inflationary rate of some sort. It gives a little more flexibility for local jurisdictions to generate some more income on property tax to address some of the needs in our community that specifically would go to things like law enforcement, public safety, and potentially behavioral health and affordable housing. Back on the infrastructure side of things, water has been a major topic. We're lucky enough to receive $1.85 million for Ingleside Reservoir. That is under design right now and should alleviate many of our concerns on the south side of town, but we still have an overall storage issue. We have an ongoing study with a consultant right now that is reviewing all of our storage capacity, what our potential reservoir options look like, where the best location is, how they intertie in all of our pressure zones. We had a preliminary meeting, I guess, last week. They're continuing to refine that. We should have more information later, but it all leads towards new reservoir somewhere in the 1.5 million gallon range in this community that helps serve all of our pressure zones. We have aging infrastructure. I think you've heard within those reservoirs as well. We've got 50s and 60 vintage reservoirs that are on the smaller side, that aren't seismically retrofitted. There's some of them are on critical slopes. And so we need to address those at the same time, take those offline. They become a liability to the community. Do we keep putting money into this infrastructure and maintaining this infrastructure, improving these over time, or do we invest in new infrastructure that's going to serve us better in the short and long term? The satellite wastewater treatment plant, also, we received funding past that design for the reclaimed water tank that's happening right now. We have a conditional use hearing August 1st, I believe, for the tank, so that requires a conditional use permit, so it's going through on August 1st. Hopefully, the hearing from that will continue working through that project at the same time. And then I think to wrap it up, basically, we just met with the Port of Shelton. They were successful in a federal appropriation, a community project funding grant from Congressman Kilmer's office. About $1 million for an extension of a sewer line from on Spring Roads from the high school to Highway 101. The total ask was about $2.8 million. It wasn't really funded. So with the funds that were appropriated, we're looking at doing the design on that project. So we could have a shovel-ready project in the next 9 months to a year, and so that could be a right project to ask for additional funding potentially from the state to build out that sewer line. That not only opens up economic development opportunities near the Port of Shelton, because our satellite plant doesn't necessarily have the capacity to serve that entire area, but also some underserved areas around Spring Road out to 101, as you know, the Evergreen Mobile Estates, Hidden Haven, and some of those areas that are close proximity, aging infrastructure on those single lots. Well, some of them have some class B or group septic systems, but they're quite old. Some of them are failing, and not the best case scenario for some of them. Some of the individuals that live in those areas. So
Probably the wrong meeting, but extending that the water out to the port would require annexation, correct? We're not going to invest any of our money in it.
the water line. This is a sewer line.
Water.
Yeah, sewer line. Yeah, it's in the UGA, so. I mean, that's kind of the decision whether that's extended there or not. It's we certainly have other needs within the city of Shelton. But it could open up some economic development, like I said, at the Port of Shelton. Yeah. Our current code does require a waiver of annexation, a waiver of protest annexation, or annexation outright if you connect to one of our utilities. I think that better answers your question, right? Yeah, sorry about that. AWC has also talked about local control of unfunded or underfunded mandates from the state. I think that's really important. Should have to harp on again. It's like a broken clock. The smaller jurisdictions, small municipalities, limited resources, those mandates that come down to us are a burden to the city of Shelton, and continuing to demonstrate to our decision makers and how they affect us and how we can best put those in place with the available resources. Need to continue taking that opportunity to communicate with them.
So would that be something we talked to Troy about with the Supreme Court and Bar Association rules coming our way? That would be a huge priority for us and the county.
In defense, I mean, Washington State Supreme Court will make the decision, but certainly the opportunity to seek funding from the state to offset some of those costs or address the availability of defense attorneys needs to be considered.
Well, we understand they're not there. Even if you had the money for them, you're not there. So, I mean, somebody's got to fight for that. I don't know if the legislative delegation can set up something to go after or even lobby the Supreme Court to not send this or adopt these guidelines, because it's going to be huge. I mean, we attended an AWC listening session. I've Councilmember Sherman and I have sat in on the public safety, so meetings and, it's gonna be pretty big. They're saying Seattle could take every single public defender in the state and still not have enough, and the rest of us have none. So it's gonna be a pretty big deal.
I think that's where we look for some support, right? Whether it's some allocation or offset, the costs associated with hiring indigent defense, you know, and the state really looks at how those services are being provided throughout all of our communities rather than allowing or standing by or whatever you, however you want to however you want to say it, having these larger jurisdictions be able to essentially, you know, commit to hiring the available defense attorneys. Maybe there's more attorneys out there that would go to in the field. If there's some other resources provided to them as well. Because that's another option, not just taking what's there available now, but encouraging those to get into the defense field.
The legislature's gonna have a lot to say on this come January, and then Mark has mentioned AWC. I know we focused tonight mostly on sort of the infrastructure projects, but I am available. You know, AWC does a pretty good job representing municipalities in Olympia, and legislators tend to listen to them. But if there are circumstances that are unique to Shelton, where we can say, us too, here's our story, I'm available to share that either in writing or testimony with our delegation. Or if there are policy issues that come up that may not even fit within AWC's agenda, but it's something unique to Shelton that's not infrastructure or transportation related. I can carry the banner on that too. We just haven't had a lot of that over the years because the focus has primarily been on getting some of these infrastructure projects in place. But I am available to do that on your behalf. The only other point that I would
Please.
make, Mark, is I think, and I kind of glossed over this, but typically the state, when we're talking about transportation or infrastructure projects, they like to be the last dollars in, not the first.
Yeah.
And so where we can demonstrate some community investment, some resources that the city has put in, or if there have been studies that we have funded or participated in that shows the need, all of that stuff should be accounted for. Because the last thing they want to do is come in with the first seed money. They want to help finish projects, not get them started.
Yeah.
I know we've done a really good job over the years, Mark and others before him of demonstrating that we put skin in the game. And then that builds our case for when we ask for the appropriation during the legislative session.
That's where the transportation, the district has been a great asset, because it's supplemental funding specifically towards transportation. It shows there's local skin in the game, if you will. The voters approved it. There's the ability to offset the investment coming out of the state transportation budget specifically. So with the sunset of that in 2026, we have to be conscious of how that affects future transportation budgets.
The only other thing I'll point out is more of a process comment, but I'm glad we're having this discussion in July. As early as we can get our priorities nailed down and sent to our delegation, the better. We've heard that from them directly.
Yeah.
I've always heard that in all my work that, you know, you can't come to the table in January, it's too late. So the quicker we can get our inventory, have you prioritize the list and get it to our delegation, the better chance we have of being successful in January. Because if you start in January, you're not there.
And I think that's part of the process tonight. I'd like to have some feedback, you know, what we just talked about, is there anything kind of in the back of your minds you want staff to research, address, we'll to put together, you know, more, maybe more comprehensive list, give that back to you, get some more feedback, and then we'll start developing that priority list and try to set up a meeting with our delegation here, maybe early fall, and really have a sit down with them, because I think it's really beneficial to have a one-on-one across the table and show and demonstrate those needs, even take them for a tour and show them some of the areas that we're speaking about, because that, you know, that memory is ingrained, right? The visual is there at the same time, and doing that as possible. So I'm open to suggestions and comments.
I personally, I think, I know we're in the study, the water storage is huge. I mean, that could cause us down the road just a halt in building if we don't get proper storage for fire flow and everything else. So I think that we should still continue to look for funds to build that 1.5 million gallon tank. If that's what we need. That is one.
Water,
No.
water, more water. Quality
I
and
mean, how-
quantity of water. Emphasizing water. That's the logjam for us to grow, is providing a clean source of water for everyone. I'd also like to include the tribes in this. How can we work together to preserve our water? Those are my 2 priorities for next year.
I was gonna say, yeah, and housing's important as well, you know, I think regulations, I don't know if there's anything that's anybody's looking at, regulations are getting more and more complicated and expensive to build a home. Whether it be electrical or plumbing and breakers on top of breakers and energy code is getting harder and harder to, and adding, you know, $20,000-$30,000 to a house today, and how can we have affordable housing when, you know, when the first $80,000 is new codes, you know. I don't know if it's 80, I'm just threw that in the air, so, but I know it's a lot, I know it's getting more and more expensive to build a house.
Affordable housing is important, but it falls right in with water, so. Ties together.
They're linked to each other, but water is the logjam.
And also, I don't know, you know, what we're looking at with our sewer system's now 14 years old, and you know, we also would like someday, I don't know if, you know, to not put anything out into the bay and
Yeah.
spray filter injection wells. I don't know if states gonna be into that here and tribes in the future, so keep that on the list for maybe if it's a list that we just do every year, you know.
We've talked about that northern conversion project, it would take the entire north side of town to the satellite plant. Obviously, we need to add some capacity to that plant. You need a pump station in Maine. We targeted a federal request along those lines, weren't successful, but again, that's a message you need to keep. You know, keep communicating, because I don't want to say it's squeaky wheel, but if this is a need now, it doesn't go away, and we need to keep communicating that need. If we just think we're not receiving the funding first time and walk away from it, it's not gonna be funded again. That's not the case. It's not the case. Things change, the need stays the same, the need most likely grows at the same time.
You know, keep being good stewards of or waters. I mean, we got nobody's listening probably today, but we've got yesterday, I got a letter from the Department of Ecology of 4 years now of excellence as an award for our sewer system, and 2 years in a row awards for the reclaimed waters. So that's pretty exciting. We got staff working really hard on that. I think we'll probably hear more about that in the next few meetings.
Tribal support has been key on some of our successes. I know they were helpful on the Lakecomer agreement and on some of our water quality projects that we pursued in the past, so. Definitely need to stay engaged there. That could make the difference. They carry a lot of influence in Olympia in our community, so.
This is our chance to ask what we'd like to see. Anybody, George, you have anything that? You know, this is asking for money, asking for legislative changes, support and bills that are coming up or have already passed that we'd like to see go away. You know, like we had the one last year that went away or got changed, the pursuit bill, which was hindering our officers from doing their jobs and stuff like that. You know, you can ask anything, you take notes and.
And this doesn't close the door.
Yeah.
You know, we can continue having conversations or send me an email or schedule a meeting, but we can continue having these conversations over the next several weeks. But we certainly want to be cognizant of our delegation's timeline and as they move closer to session and said, getting the information in front of them. As soon as we can.
Yeah. Anything on your mind, Melissa?
I mean, I'm just gonna go ahead and echo what's already been said. Any sort of money that we can get towards infrastructure projects like the reservoir project, that'll take some of the heat off of our ratepayers. George, I know that that's a big one for you. Like, if we could get something like that, could relieve people, and if we can get more building coming in, it's going to build more local revenue, so we'll be less reliant on these sort of funding sources. So those are the big ones that I'd see, like infrastructure, or if we can extend sewer and we can get more growth that way, again, it's another great way for us to build our own local revenues. So those sorts of things are key items for me.
I also think we can build up our capacity for the sewage treatment plant and maybe work with the county to work on the solid waste problem and furthering cleaning up our water. So anything having to do with water, including hyping up our or using our solid waste capacities and growing that as well.
So what I'm hearing from our constituents and our community is their priorities are safety, housing, water, and jobs. So they all playing in together one way or another. And so when they're telling us that's their priorities, and that's our priority.
Lindsay?
Completely agree with that, Jackie. That's exactly what I was gonna say, water, housing and law enforcement or defense attorneys, anything we can do for safety.
And I also want to be a resource to everyone. Mark does a really good job of asking me questions and I can help get answers if you have questions that, you know, you go home tonight and think of other ideas. We can always run those trap lines and see, you know, what we can do. I'm fairly open. My email and cell is it's online, so it's also on the presentation from tonight, but yeah, anything you can think of, questions. This doesn't have to be a one-shot deal either. I'm always happy to come back as we refine this agenda, whether it's in a work session or just in a meeting upstairs with the delegation. I'll be around, happy to do that. I'm just down the highway, right on the county line. You know, my wife practices law here in town, so I have a lot of connections and affection for the community. Want to be here as a resource for all of you.
Anything?
Anything else there?
Anybody else have anything? All right, does council have any new items for discussion tonight? No? Then we will adjourn the study session at 6:46 PM.
Recording stopped.
For the time on a lovely 80-degree